Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. I want to talk about gravity again because it's a frustrating subject when you talk to people that are formally educated, like all of us were at some point, because it's controlling a lot of people's minds in terms of how the universe is put together. And I think I figured out a way to describe it such that you can all get on the same page. I'm always telling you that there's only one book of physics in the universe. And that's very, very important. And what that means is there's one method by which everything that exists in this matter-based reality, this matter-based cosmology, exists physically. How it all comes together. You know this inherently by observing your life. But the definition of gravity, as formerly taught, is a complete contradictory theory of how everything works in your life. 100%. Let's get to some details. And this is going to be an episode described, hopefully, so that anyone can understand what I'm saying. This is going to contain repeat examples from other episodes, but hopefully strung together in a way that is a lot easier to digest. So what do we mean by bringing everything together? What is everything? Well, if you're just a normal human being, you would look at people, objects, maybe animals and insects. You may divide those up. But then you've got mountains, rivers, atmosphere. Maybe think about the atmosphere. You have this place we're standing on top of. We have objects in the sky as well. Now, I'm not going to try to get into alternate theories of all these things, but I will just put a footnote on that subject to say we may be in some sort of simulation. And I'm not saying that to be fancy. I'm saying that because there are some interesting avenues that could suggest that. We're going to try to stay away from that because I don't want to get off on a tangent. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about plenty of episodes I put out about simulations, and it's all under the keyword of matrix. So go to deepthoughtsradio.com, go to the search field and search on matrix, or just go down to the category list and click on matrix and you'll find all those episodes. I think most of you know I'm pretty liberal with considering other ideas. But if you're a physicist or you've taken some physics in school, when I say what is everything in terms of the mass-based universe that we're in, the energy, mass-based energy universe that we're in, you might think of atoms. If you study hadron colliders or colliders in general, you might even go down to thinking about quarks. If you're a cosmologist, you might think about the solar system, the universe, weird objects like quasars and pulsars. Okay. What I'm telling you is something you already know, but you may not consciously think about it, which is there's one book of physics that makes everything possible in the universe. And that means that everything written in that book is congruent with everything else written in the book, meaning step one or principle one, law one gets along with law two, gets along with law three. Everything gets along and is complementary to each other in creating the universe that we have. Gravity. Some of you know the definition of gravity. One, it has the big word phenomenon in it because it is a lie. Phenomenon and science don't go together. They just don't. How come paranormal people that study paranormal sciences, ghosts, and that kind of thing, they're always poo-pooed by the quote-unquote official science people, the Neil deGrasse Tyson people, when he's towing around the traditional theory of gravity that has the word phenomenon in it? Isn't that weird? So what is the traditional definition of gravity? They want you to believe that two things in the universe, and you can go down to a quark, you can go down to an atom, you can go down to a person or a planet, that they somehow exchange information with each other no matter where they are in the universe. What do I mean by exchange information? Why do I put it that way? Because that's the way you need to see it in your brain so that the absurdity of it starts to sink in. So you have one atom in the universe on the right side and one atom on the universe on the left side. No matter how far away those objects are from each other, they're pulling on each other. pull. In order for them to know about each other, in order to create this phenomenon, bogus theory of gravity, they have to exchange information about each other. How big are you? Well, I'm bigger than you, so you come over here. Well, I still am somebody, so you got to come over to me a little bit. Okay, I'll weasel over, but you know what? You're going to come at me a lot faster. I'm coming at you. That's the sort of information they want you to believe that any particle of matter that you can conceive of actually does. That is the complete inverse of what is happening. Atoms don't talk to each other. They don't talk to each other at all. They may get into a relationship with each other on a physical realm and dance together. But they don't really talk to each other at all. Case in point, you got a lot of people pushing out of a theater or a stadium at night, and you're all kind of bunching up together and stuff, right? Well, you can get bunched up by a stranger and have your movement controlled by a stranger because they're not getting out of your way, or they're 800 pounds or whatever. You don't know them. You're not exchanging any information with them, but they're affecting your flow. Do you think red blood cells inside the body have conversations as they go by? Hi, Pete. Hi, Henry. How you doing? Hey, Alan. No. They're in a system. And by design, they're constraining that system, and that system creates interruptions, creates flows. And what's the value of knowing how gravity really works? Well, one, the whole universe is going to come together in your brain beautifully if you understand everything that I'm going to put in this episode. You will. And when you understand this, when you explore other sciences, especially the creation of energy, you're going to know a lot about a lot of the BS that you've been told throughout your life. And it should, if you're remotely scientific and into this kind of stuff, especially electronics, energy harvesting, energy flow in the universe. Because the thing is, if you wanted a tidal wave of water to come through your house, well, you know, you'd have to create some sort of aqueduct or something to divert the water to your house, to have infinite water in your house. You would have to. That's what plumbing is. Surround it with the pipe. But there's all kinds of ways of doing it, right? If you live down a hill and there's a lake up above, well, you know, you can dig a little irrigation and bring it right down to your house. The universe is doing this by design. The universe is also such an amazing thing that when you contemplate how simple the universe actually works with what I'm going to tell you, it seems fantastical. And that's why true scientists that understand the absolute odds of what we are seeing, especially being conscious beings inside of a vessel, they become believers in a central creation, typically, on some subliminal level. They may not believe a word in any book that's been written with stories in it from any religion anywhere around the world. They might find value in that, and they may believe it as well. And you can have both if you want. But once you understand how the universe works, it all falls together. It makes sense why the planets are the way they are. It makes sense why there's round bodies in space. It makes sense while you are held down to the surface of this thing that we live on called Earth. Now, let's take some examples that you are very much aware of. And you were aware of these things probably before you hit the age of 10, if you just had a normal childhood. When you dumped food coloring into water, especially in the American holiday known as Easter, so that you could dye eggs. It was one of the most sort of rewarding things when you were a kid. You had some vinegar water, and you're dropping these food coloring down inside. Now, they had tablets too when I was a kid, but we'll push that off. Tablets still do the exact same thing. But you saw that splash of color in water. You know, there's soothing videos on YouTube that go for 12 hours that do things like that, show you these amazing things in nature, slicing bread, you know. But you notice that when you saw the way that the food coloring dispersed in the water, it looks remarkably like a thick smoke billowing out from someplace. Perhaps a cigarette, a cigar, some manufacturing of some sort, a fire outside that you might put together to keep the family warm. Smoke behaves very similar to the stuff in water. In fact, the only difference that you're aware of subliminally is that air is a little less dense, water is very dense, and so, the exact way that it flows and diffuses into the water is slightly different. It's typically called fluid dynamics, but you don't need to know any of that to understand that you already understand how it works. Now, I was interviewing Bart Sibrel, and I mentioned an alternate theory of the shape of the Earth to him, and he said, well, there's bubbles. There's bubbles in water. It seems to be a very logical shape in the universe. And when he said that, he tripped a domino in my head, and it clicked. The analogy that I've been giving in several episodes of different subject matters, that is it. When you see a bubble in water, what are you seeing? Well, you're seeing, obviously, a pressure system curving the water. Let me repeat that. Curving the water around a pocket of air. And why is it a circle? And why is it just perfect? Because in a container of water, without touching other things, it'll be a perfect sphere because there's one book of physics in the universe. Water, if of even density, which is typically how we experience it, will push evenly on all sides, curving itself around that bubble of water. But for some reason, we've lost track of that basic thing. I never paid attention to it in a physics model. And it wasn't until an alternate theory came around that I started thinking about these kind of things. The reason why you're held down to this sphere of crust floating in space, whatever that is, and that someone in America can be standing on one side of the sphere and someone in India on the other side of the world could be standing with his feet, technically pointing at my feet, is the same exact pressure system that's pushing on the bubble in fluid. If you were a little bacteria inside that water, you could be on one side of the bubble being pushed against the bubble by the water, and another bacteria could be on the other side of that bubble being pushed on the opposite side as the water curves around the other substance known as oxygen. Could actually be anything as long as it won't mix with the water. Could be oil. But they have different weights, And air bubbles in water typically try to move up. The universe is nothing more than the most amazing collection of pressure systems, I think caused by a particle called ether, but you could call it anything you want. And this substance, although you can't hold it in your hand and tangibly see an individual discrete particle of it, it actually makes up everything that you see. It makes you up. It makes the oxygen that you breathe, the food that you eat, the chair you're sitting on, the surface of this place called Earth that we're standing on or sitting on or laying on. You're being pushed against other things. If the Earth is really large, it'll push down on you harder. If the Earth is small, it won't push down on you as much. And why is that? Well, my analogy has always been the same thing. Almost every single person, probably by the age of 15 years old, has been in a situation where you're in a very open area. I would say, in my brain, I always see it as a football field, an American football field, but you could do FIFA football field. It works great. And your friend is on the other side in the goal zone, and you're completely on the opposite side. And you can wave to each other because light will travel, and you can say hi. And you start walking at each other. It's super gusty wind. It's one of those days you really don't want to be outside. Now, you get to the point where you're about 10 feet from each other, about 3 meters, and you still have about the same amount of wind pushing on you consciously. You're getting hit in the chest with the same amount of gusty wind. But the second that you close that gap, potentially with someone that you're attracted to, and you only have about 6 inches between your chests, now you can feel what is holding the entire universe together in terms of a principal law. And you don't need any gravity phenomenon, you need gravity pressure system. A lot of people will say gravity doesn't exist, and I actually would say you're probably 100% correct in that they have created a verb known as gravity, and they've defined it completely contradictory to everything else that we're seeing happening in the universe. So you're right. You're honestly right. And should we create a new word to describe gravity? Maybe. But we also have pre-existing things like rate of speed of falling. We have the word pressure. We really don't need the word gravity anymore if you understand how the universe works. But now, why are you feeling that relief from wind when you're 6 inches from somebody else in a windy day in an open field? Well, you know it. You already know the answer to this. Their back is blocking wind that would normally hit your chest, and your back is blocking wind that would hit their chest. And so there's this kind of low pressure system between your chests. You're not getting hit as much. Two human beings are roughly the same size, and they're going to roughly have the same effect on each other. But now what if instead of a human being, you chose to walk up to a wall, a big giant wall, huge, Fenway Stadium's wall, right? And it's super windy. Well, have you ever been in a major city when it's really windy and you go up against a surface, a building usually, and it's like there's a lot less pressure on you, there's a lot less wind on you, not only on your front, which is facing the building, but your back isn't getting as much either. Because that building is disrupting the wind. The currents of wind around the building are completely different once you get closer. Now, certain buildings won't have that effect on your back, but they'll definitely have that effect on your front. There'll be zero pressure, for all intents and purposes, pushing on your chest if you get really close to the building. Now, take the analogy that we just discussed, where the wind, if blocked from one side of your body, creates a negative pressure, so you're kind of being sucked in that direction, technically speaking. The only reason why you don't get pushed across the field is that your feet are on the ground. But if you're in space, let's just say, and you had all that force of wind against your back, but not in your front, you're gonna get pushed. Well, the Earth is this amazing thing that we're gonna get into, but it's got a very distinct capability in the universe. It is a gigantic ball of a natural shape, just like a bubble, and it's blocking a tremendous amount of ether from hitting you from underneath. But all the ether that could hit you from above is hitting you from above. Now, the reason why you're not squished like an ant is because you have a limited amount of size, and so your size literally is how much ether hits you, which is another way of saying how much pressure you feel from above. Why does Shaq O'Neal feel completely different when he gets up in the morning than you? Because he is a much larger being. He possesses more mass. And the more that you possess, the more that this ether hits you. It's just sheer design, right? It's like the difference between a pin light and a gigantic spotlight that you would see out in front of a movie theater in the olden days, right? So the bigger the Earth is, this ethereal stuff that is the pressure system that you can't see with your eyes, and when you look out to space at night, and you see that void of blackness with all these little sparkling things we call stars, you can't see the ether. And so, obviously, it's not you being ignorant. Maybe ignorant is the right word for all of us, but we initially don't conceive of anything being there. But at the same time, we take breaths of air, and we know oxygen exists, even though we don't consciously think about it. We know it's there because we know people get in situations where there is no oxygen and they die. So the brain has no problem with that one because it's part of our ecosystem. It's part of filling our lungs up with nourishment, which will go into the system and flush things out. It is part of our system. What's the other big thing inside the human body? Well, water. And I won't try to quote how much water is in the human body because I hear outrageous differences between the low 70s and the high 90s. Well, let's just put it this way. We got a lot of water in us. So I need you to understand that even though you don't see anything when you look up at the stars, it's there. Just the mere fact that you can look at a star, and I don't care what it is. I mean, I do, but not for this conversation. The idea that light could even get to your eyeball means that there's a medium. There's something between it and you that allows it to wiggle in a verb, this reaction that by the time it hits the rods and cones of your eye, it pushes pressure, like ripples of a pond. It pushes pressure against those rods and cones, which then, thankfully, goes back to the visual cortex, upside down and backwards, and then your brain flips it around because it wants you to not wants you not to feel like you're walking on the sky, right? And it gets them reinterpreted. I mean, the human brain and probably the soul system that's underneath it, the operating system, is an amazing thing. Why would a body in space be orbiting another body? Why would that happen? Well, it might seem a little strange because here on Earth, we don't have anything orbiting our heads, right? You can't just take a candy corn and throw it in the air and it starts looping around your head because you don't have enough negative pressure by blocking the wind to make that occur. But when you have a giant ball in space, it's really a giant ball of ethereal energy. When it slows down, remember when ether slows down, the very first moment you can see ether as a human being with the eye sockets that we have as Homo sapiens is plasma energy, which is ironic because without knowing it's actually created by ether, you're always told that the bolt of lightning is moving around the speed of light. It's a very fast-moving substance, which is why it's aggravating the atmosphere to the point it's viewed as so bright. Looking into it burns your eyes, right? If you happen to be staring out in the Midwest at a lightning storm and something strikes fairly close, you'll have that memory in your eyeball for a few seconds, just like someone flashing their bright lights at you in a car. But that's actually the slowest velocity, slowest speed the ether can move before you see it. But at all times, ether is moving at its normal rate of speed, which we have to take the measurements between Faraday in the mid-1800s and Nikola Tesla from the late 1800s well into the 20th century at 50 times the speed of light. 50 times the speed of light. But it's also a very small particle. Have you ever heard that if you zoomed up an atom, which they do exist, they're just not made the way that you're traditionally taught, although the colliders are actually telling you that they really do, or at least should understand how atoms are made out of a particle that will go down to the pure definition of an ethereal particle. We'll get into that a little bit in a second. You might be thinking, well, why am I not squished by this stuff? Why am I not being hurled across the surface of the earth and thrown into space by this stuff if it's everywhere? And the reason why goes back to that old analogy that my physics teacher taught me in high school. He said if a proton and a neutron were the size of grapefruits sitting on the pitcher's mound of an average size baseball stadium, that the first electron that you could sense would be at the edge of that stadium and be about the size of a BB. Now, they're not solid state things. We'll get into that. You'll understand it. But there's a lot of space between things. And so this ethereal stuff is moving through mainly negative space. But it does have enough to collide with that things actually do get held down or pushed around in the universe. Now, planets are very interesting, but they're also the same thing as moons, and they're the same thing as stars, at least the one that we see in the sky. Again, there's some serious anomalies with eclipses. We'll just bypass that for now and go with official science. But let's say that I'm standing somewhere, and ether is moving both through me to create me, but also moving through me and entering the Earth's surface. Maybe it's going from my back and it's going through me and it's hitting you in the front, but it's moving through you as well. Okay. But when you make a ball out of spiraling ether, which is a natural sort of three-dimensional rain drain, it's in the shape of a torus, which is basically a glorified word for donut. But instead of being sort of the donut you buy at the shop, it's more like a sphere with an hourglass cut from the top to the bottom in the center. So some people view it as an hourglass, some people view it as the overall toroidal shape that's around the outside. Ether is going to be in every single spot inside this shape. It's being given that designation of a donut or a torus because of the way that ether is moving predominantly through that area. Again, have you ever squished something with your hands? Between your fingers, like a junior mint. I always like to squish them in my fingers and break that seal before I put them in my mouth. I don't know why. But it squeezes out. You see these shows on YouTube where the guy is compressing things, baseballs and rolls of quarters and all kinds of wild ball bearings and stuff. The same reason that the stuff gushes out when you compress it is the same reason why everything happens in the universe. Now, of course, there's going to be a question of where all this stuff comes from. And I can't answer that, of course. So let's talk about, for 1 second here, if I'm telling you that gravity is the opposite of what they say it is, then how on earth do the current formulas in science happen to predict so much stuff? Rocketeering, aviation, general physics, simulators inside video games, inside 3D software, CAD/CAM software, etc. Well, it goes back to something I told you guys probably about 7 years ago, which is that you can actually have a very accurate algorithm, but completely misunderstand its cause. Now, there's a fable that Galileo got up on the Leaning Tower of Pisa before I guess it was leaning, and he drops 2 balls off the top because he wanted to see would a heavier ball drop faster than a little ball. Now, infinitesimally speaking, they now claim that the big ball will hit just a little bit before the little ball, but for the most part, it's generally the same. Now, at this point, I'm not exactly sure how much of the gravity theory was proliferated inside society, but let's just say that he comes up with this gravity theory, and he does the calculations. He gets terminal velocity figured out. He gets it all figured out. His calculations, let's just say, are perfect. And he attributes this in his algorithm to the letter G, gravity. Now, what I'm about to say is completely fictitious, so don't get this in your memory banks as something that really happened. But let's say that the church, the Jesuit priests of his time, who have absolutely usurped all the power that anyone could have in this world into the church. And here's this guy creating a whole way of thinking that starts to predict actually very important events using this calculation of gravity. All the Jesuits care about is that the power was just ever so slightly siphoned out to this stuff called mathematics. And they're not idiots. They've got all the math from the Egyptians, the Babylonians, then the Greeks, version 2. And so they swoop in and they say, okay, here's, they house arrest the guy and they're saying, look, here's the deal. You cannot take anything away from God, aka the church, aka the Roman Senate, that turned into popes and then saints. So here's what we're going to do. Your little G on this piece of paper just turned into AP, angel power. In fact, we'll make the P a exponential little p off to the right of the A. So it's an angel using their power. They are the ones that push everything to the ground. Your calculation is going to remain the same, but in the eyes and especially the mind's eye of the people, they are going to see angels now that they understand this stuff called gravity, which is obviously a contextual framing of just nothing more than the pressure system that's holding together everything else that you know about. Smoke, water, the principles of diffusion. There are instruments now around the world that are claiming to sense gravity waves. I haven't personally inspected those devices to make sure that it's all on the up and up, but let's just say I do believe that you could absolutely sense ripples in the ether. Now again, they want to keep it out of the lexicon of man because ether will lead to your ultimate understanding of electricity. It will help you understand where crude oil comes from, it not being a fossil fuel. It is the key to unwind all of the stuff they have wound up using fakes like Einstein, who definitely at one point was an abject moron. I think over the course of 50 years of his false fame, he probably ended up coming up with something, where he's smarter than the average Joe. but still below anyone who's a true scientist who actually knows what the photoelectric effect actually is, that he was awarded a 1/3 Nobel Prize for, but then couldn't explain it as he goes around saying, "This is what I got this Nobel Prize for." Isn't that great? What's interesting about gravity waves is that it actually lends itself perfect to the ripples in water. A pressure system. Why would there be a ripple in water? I mean, you're throwing a rock into, say, a lake or a pond or something that's very still, and then you watch those ripples. Big boat comes by and you're on the coast, and everyone gets ready for these giant wakes to come in, depending on how strong the boat is and how far away you are from it, right? That's because the water itself has its own pressure system, and the atmosphere has its own pressure system. As the water curves during a ripple situation, it's obviously got a diminishing frequency in it, right? So the frequency gets usually longer and longer and longer, and the amplitude also changes, meaning how up and down does this frequency push itself into the sky, and then down into the water, and up into the sky, and down into the water. The same thing's happening probably out there in the universe. Now, why it's happening, not quite sure. They want you to believe that the universe is really chaotic, that a bunch of really loud, violent things are occurring. Now, I haven't traveled the universe, so I can't exactly say it's not or it is, but I'm going to tell you that our solar system in general, and if we're in a simulation, then it's stable for very obvious reasons. They don't want the Westworld to suddenly disappear and explode, right? They may dramatize things in a simulation to make you think that things are going awry, and that's outside of NASA selling doom, which I have an episode on. But the overall flow of ether into the North Pole of any spinning toroidal planet, sun, or moon is exactly the way that it's flowing through you. It is creating you second to second, and it is sustaining you second to second, the same way that it is sustaining everything else in the universe. What's really interesting is, once you get some ether banging into each other in a particular way, unless super agitated by heat, you have an atom, and it's a beautiful thing. It can then combine with other atoms to create compounds, and then higher and higher structures, which is obviously coming up to like Homo sapiens sapien. Seriously speaking, I don't know of anything that's organic that is more complex than a human being. If we met an alien race, we might find a Lilu with 5 times the DNA. That would be the only time we'd really see something that's more complex than we are. The animal kingdom, for as amazing as it is, hasn't created a being that's more complex than the human being. Obviously, if the monkeys rise up and take over the place, they might be able to claim some fame, but we're not there yet. But now there's a bunch of things online that are very, very interesting, and one of them, I just had a friend send me this email today. It's very helpful. There's this surge in belief that we had giants on this world, and I don't mean the giants that are of the skeletons that we have found, that were seen by thousands, reported in dozens and dozens of newspapers across the United States, had their bones photographed in some cases, and then the Smithsonian comes and takes them away and loses them, basically steals them from society. I hardly think that they would destroy them. No, we're talking about giants that are the size of mountains. And what these people are doing is they're looking at anything that organically kind of looks like a face, a hand, a tendon muscle, and they're trying to tell you that that was a living being, that human life used to be silicone-based 100% back in the day. Trees used to be silicone-based. I mean, it's a romantic idea. I think that you will find that you lack the individual components necessary within a silicone family to get the sort of life algorithms that need to exist. There's a book out there written by Stephen Wolfram. He's the inventor of Mathematica. Sort of a super smart guy. And I had to read this book for research on a major film franchise. And it's called A New Kind of Science. The book is massive. Okay? It's got small print. It's pretty giant page size. And then it's at least 3.5 inches thick. It's gigantic. So I'll summarize sort of what one of the most brilliant things the book actually asserts and I believe proves. Stephen Wolfram was interested in the question of how many particles would the universe have to have, distinct particles, in order to create the universe that we have today. Is it 2? Is it 12, 20, a million? And so he turned on his Mathematica software and he put the algorithm in. He creates essentially a representation of a three-dimensional world, which is what Mathematica does beautifully, and said, okay, if I had 2 particles, what kind of pattern would you create in 2 particles? And obviously it created a pattern very quickly. It goes up to like 12. 12 starts creating a beautiful organic pattern. But believe it or not too far into the algorithm, it starts creating a pattern. And what do I mean by pattern? Well, it would be like you're knitting a quilt and you do something random every time you complete a knot. It's just strange looking, right? It's all really kind of soupy and free flowing, right? No square inch looks like another square inch on your quilt or on your whatever, your Afghan from Afghanistan. And then at some point, miraculously, it all turns into a pattern. Without even trying, you start knitting, and as much as you try to create a different pattern, it just starts becoming a checker pattern or some other wild pattern. And so what this guy found, it's very important to think about, was that the optimal position in the number system that creates infinite randomness was 3.5. So at 2.5, you got a pattern. At 4, up, you got patterns. Now, sometimes it takes a longer amount of time to start the pattern. Like a 4 takes a lot longer to start a pattern than a 12. Isn't that strange? The more discrete particles that could exist in the universe start creating patterns. And the problem with a pattern is it negates life. You can't have a human being if we start turning into a checker pattern at the subatomic level, because we'll just look like a checkerboard. So in order for there to be a rhino and a orangutan and a palm tree and a grain of sand and you and your mom and your brother and your computer, but mostly organic stuff, of course, 3.5, which is probably a 3 or a 4, is the best estimation of how many particles exist in the universe. Now, that could be 3 different ethereal particles, or it could be ethereal particles creating, by getting grouped up and bunched up in the universe, 3 distinct donut-shaped toruses that can then go and create higher construct things because it remains random. Haven't you ever seen flowers that look like phalluses, right? They look like the private parts of men. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, that's really weird. And the thing is you got to stop and realize those are patterns within the infinite combination of what we have. That is simply the way that organic matter grows. It's going in a direction. It gets hindered. It starts to bulge up at one end. Then it breaks. It gets to the next level and starts to exhaust it, or it's just done growing. The interesting thing about diffusion, when you put that food coloring into, say, water, so you get red food coloring into water, and if you just let it set, it diffuses. In the phenomenon gravity sense of the situation, technically speaking, whatever's heavier should clump up together. But it's essentially the assertion that the water is, because it's all liquid, it's pulling from all angles, from all sides, and it's diffusing the red into the water, so it's a light pink, and about 10 minutes later. I remember being in biology where they taught a little bit of chemistry, and the teacher showed us this, literally a beaker, put some red dye in there, and then said, oh, this is diffusion. But she was such a dry woman with no personality whatsoever that the magic of that moment was completely lost. Plus she had bad breath you could smell 20 feet away. But when it comes to an ethereal model of why diffusion would occur, it's because the ether is pounding everything in that beaker from all directions. It is the easiest way to understand diffusion. There was an experiment once to prove that ether didn't exist. The scientists who were trying to prove that didn't exist thought that ether could be routed down a pipe. It's one of the experiments anyway. And they had sensors at the bottom of a pipe. So imagine you just point a pipe at the sky and say, well, if ether exists, it should come from space and go down into this pipe and hit this sensor. But if I turn it 45 degrees, well, it should be a little less ether coming in the pipe, like it's water or something. Well, it is water. But they failed to, I think they understood this completely. They created an experiment that would convince your average Joe that this was actually a technically accurate result. But they didn't tell the people that ether goes through that pipe at 50 times the speed of light. I mean, it is going through everything. And again, the only thing that is very special about capturing ether, and this most likely happens at the center of an atom, which is why the gentleman who created Coral Castle said that at the center of an atom is a photon. And he says, you've been lied to. The more you study ethereal sciences, you'll understand his interpretation of that. But when you have a giant toroidal ball of ether, which is at the core of a planet, core of a moon, core of a sun, you've got a vacuum cleaner for that stuff that is unlike anything else above ground. You ever wonder why, if gravity is something pulling on something else, how does grass grow up? How do trees grow up? How did humans even come to exist? Because the second that something would be in the ground as a seed and start to sprout and grow, it should grow down, and that's it, because everything is pulling itself towards the center of the earth more violently than any other vector that you can have access to. But it doesn't. It goes up. When I was a kid, there used to be, and I'm repeating a little bit of content here from episodes that are 5 years old, but I remember at least twice in my lifetime, there'd be one of those, those little bumper news segments at the end of an evening. It's like some cool person in the television station was like, I put together this piece. Let me put it on the air. All right, whatever. Go ahead. No one's going to watch. It's 11 o'clock, but I'll be up seeing this stuff. But they kept talking about this opposite force that comes out of the earth. It was infinitesimal. I don't want to try to quote what I heard, but it's obviously a fraction of what gravity is supposedly doing, pushing everything, sucking everything down in it. I've seen this twice on television, a couple times on the internet. What you are actually hearing, or what I was actually hearing, was that as the ether penetrates the Earth's crust and gets caught in that toroidal ball, the spinning furnace inside, ejecting the Van Allen belts out of the base of the South Pole at super condensed lethal rates, and then bring it all back in at the North Pole, there's a bunch that bounces off like a dielectric wave or dielectric force. It does bounce off the core and come back out of the crusts. Could be that the toroidal itself is actually hurling out bits and pieces of ether. And so if you're looking for a force coming out of the ground, it's there. It's what pushes up a blade of grass. It's what pushes up the first crystals that turn into a tree. I mean, look at a redwood tree and then tell me all about this force that's yanking down mass against mass. Have you ever seen a picture? They put a filter on it and they film the human body looking for its energy signature. And there's just this wild cloud around a human being that has electricity coming out of it. And it's all spiky on the surface. It's never smooth. And that's because probably anomalies in your epidermis. Some places are going to let out more than others. On the surface of the earth, those spikes can be trees, redwood trees, blades of grass. So I made two claims I want to go ahead and follow up on. How does understanding gravity, true gravity, help you understand that crude oil is not a fossil fuel? Well, scientifically speaking, at 16,000 feet down, no more life exists. But you can drill as far down as you want, and you'll find crude oil. Well, probably not infinitely down, but it's, 8 or 9 miles, it's still pumping out crude oil. So where's this stuff coming from? It obviously isn't from old organic life. There is no organic life past 16,000 feet, which is just 3 miles down. I've said this several times in episodes, but I'm just going to repeat it because, again, I don't hear this from anybody else on the web. This should be just a viral thing I'm saying here. What is crude oil? It's a combination of carbon and hydrogen. Those are the two most common atoms in the universe. Hydrogen just happens to be explosive. What's a methane particle? A methane particle is 1 carbon and 4 hydrogen. The crust of the Earth is a chemistry lab because of the infinite supply of atomic materials, now in our conversation, ethereal materials. And for whatever reason, we talked about those three particles that need to exist in the universe, about 3.5, that need to exist to create infinite patterns in the universe. Well, look at your elements in a chemistry table. Let's at least go for hydrogen. It's the most fundamental atom in the universe. And let's go for carbon. Now, the stuff that's actually creating those atoms is more fundamental and smaller, probably even less count. It's like having maybe 4 different types of Legos, but you have a billion of them, and so you can create all kinds of bigger shapes with those little ones, right? It's like we used to print out photographs using dot matrix printers, and all we could use were the characters in the keyboard, right? So coming off the edge of this electrical core of the Earth, which is 99.9% of this planet's existence, is the atomic material at the ethereal level to create a carbon atom. But it's 4 times more likely to create a hydrogen atom because it is more common. It takes less pieces, 1 neutron, 1 proton, and 1 electron. Boom, you got a hydrogen atom. Very simple. So there's a 4-to-1 ratio of the Earth's crust creating carbon. Now, this most likely happens in other locations if space is out there as we perceive it, but Earth can do this all by itself. So now you take this pressure system that's down there. I mean, could you imagine the force of the soil and the rock pushing on each other down there, plus the ultimate heat coming off a core that is made of plasma? Can't be nickel iron like they tell you, because it loses all of its magnetism at 6,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Sorry, folks. So methane gas gets created at the sub-level as the first component, and then it travels up the mantle, starts getting into the heavier rocks because it's all molten down below. You don't have a lot of pressure, you got a lot of heat, so you have a lot of fusion that potentially could occur. But it gets up into the rocks and it starts getting crushed. Well, what would happen if you crushed 2 methane particles together and could get them to fuse? We'd have 2 carbon atoms and 8 hydrogen atoms. Now we're getting closer and closer to crude oil. So it moves up and up and up and up to the point where you start getting to different octanes of crude. Crude oil is refined in a pipe. I've said this 1,000 times, but I don't hear this back from anyone else. They put it in a pipe and you boil it. Because carbon weighs more than hydrogen, the lower octane fuels like diesel fuel is way at the bottom of the pipe. Up a little ways you have kerosene, which is jet fuel. Way up above you have car fuel and maybe race car fuel. All they do is they siphon off that pipe the octane that they want, which is essentially less and less carbon inside the fuel. If you understood ether, then you would understand the ecosystem of why this isn't a fossil fuel. When we drill an oil well empty, or suck it empty, it fills back up again. Because it has a sweet spot in the way that the earth is created, wherever you're drilling, that it burps up. I'm not saying oil is the best choice of, propelling everyone around the universe. By no means. Electricity would be the best. We have to be very smart about how we do it. Electricity is the other thing the ether creates. Obviously, it's creating everything. Tesla once wrote how idiotic Einstein was that he would dare say the ether doesn't exist when every single invention and every single patent, 450 patents that Nikola Tesla came up with, were all based on ethereal sciences. Einstein is the enemy of the people. Anyone who supported him, knowing that he was a Peter Sellers in the movie Being There, which is what that movie's about. There's a movie called Being There, Peter Sellers is in it, and it's all about Einstein. It's just showing you how stupid the people are, how gullible they are, how much they want to believe in heroes so they can put false heroes right in front of you. But he said, everything I've ever done is based on ethereal sciences. And he could sense it. It wasn't angel power. He could sense it. And it goes back to the mid-1800s. And now you were taught not to look at it. When you learn electrical theory, you're typically taught anode theory, which is, again, positive to negative flow of electrons. When it's actually cathode, it's the only way it works, negative to positive. How come you're constantly being taught the opposite of how everything works? A lot of you want to make a difference in the universe, but you have experimented with trying to tell a loved one something really heavy, and they just lash out at you. Okay, so say that you kind of retreat home and you're like, man, I'm really not made out for this confrontational stuff, but I really want to improve the world. And I think education is something that could really make a difference, right? And you'd be 1,000% correct. These are subjects you can get into. You want to study them for yourself. If you can conduct any experiments on your own to prove it to yourself, well, that's even better. But these tiny things, making sure people understand that oil is not a fossil fuel, that if we stop drilling oil, what do you think is going to happen to the Earth's crust? All those spots in the world where oil has been drilled for, 100 and almost 200 years now. We're just a decade shy of 200 years of drilling oil. All of those reservoirs are going to fill up again. South Texas is going to be a sea of crude oil. It's one thing that the Agenda 21 maps don't take into account. It's really funny. Guys accidentally shooting the ground with a rifle and having it bubble up like Jed from Beverly Hillbillies. That's going to be able to be happening again. You're going to have tar pits. So we started this madness where we drilled it out of the ground. We use it for things. And if we stop doing that, then we can't live in those regions of the world anymore. Not unless we're willing to literally live in like a water world, except it'll be oil world, which will be extremely toxic for your body. If you want to get involved with, I wouldn't say, there are free power systems out there, because if you realize how ether works, then you will realize that they have created this fictitious distance in your brain between you and electricity. They make you think you have to have all these inventions with gears and wires in order to have any ability to capture the flow of ether, aka potentially electrons, if that's how you want to realize your energy, just to charge a battery, to drive a vehicle. Imagine that the way that we defeat the people that actually want to mess up the world is that we simply invent something very easy to make. Everybody can make it. It's maybe a few magnets, maybe it's some copper wire, maybe it's a few batteries, who knows, right? Maybe you're the one. Maybe you're like the Sarah Connor of Skynet, man. You are the one. So the jerks of the world, they go to bed on a Friday night and they're in power. And you debut that technology on a Saturday and a Sunday. By Monday morning, they're not in power anymore. It's just that simple. I mean, do you realize if you could just create a force field that could survive any projectile, and it could move around. I know that sounds crazy, but let's just say you could do that because you got the energy from the universe for free using a solid state configuration of magnetism. You can get toroidal shaped magnets, right? Or you can create them yourself with coiled wire. But imagine there's no army that could stop you. It would change the world overnight, wouldn't it? I think that the universe as a whole, the little tiny, infinitely small part of it that I've been able to look out the window and see, I think it's extremely stable. I think we have oceans of ether that have been going in the same direction for a very long time. The electrical universe images on the internet 15 years ago used to be very plentiful in the image databases of web browsers. So you go to your favorite search engine, you search on electrical universe, you could click the images button and you would see beautifully illustrated, accurate, ethereal pictures of the universe. And now they're very difficult to find. Why is that? Because the scientists that are true scientists had their, town hall meetings, their presentations at colleges and private companies, posted their stuff on the internet, and there's a energy sector out there that doesn't want you to know what they're telling you because they realize how close every human being who understands this is to inventing the next game changer of, personal power. There's a lot of you, depending on your age and depending on your vocation, you will never be able to appreciate, and this is no slight on you whatsoever, it's just the luck of the draw, what Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak did by creating the Apple computer back in 1976. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak gave the power to the people on a level that hadn't been seen for I don't even know how many centuries, maybe millennia. You could sit in your house with 110 power coming out of your wall with the Apple, especially the Apple II, 32K or 64K of RAM, a cassette tape just in case you want to store what you did. I know it sounds arcane, but if you could imagine it, you could type it in to a very simple language called Smart Basic, which Wozniak invented, and kids could change the world. Kids could program professional software. But adults could go crazy. If you have more money, you can make a better computer. But it didn't take them more than a decade to start killing that off, making programming so complicated that the average person can't do it. Today, there are devices like the Android device that have documentation that is so scatterbrained and so inaccurate for what they are wanting you to actually do with their phones. It's a wonder anything ever gets done. That's the way they want your brain when it comes to gravity and basic forms of science that will get you on the right track as long as you step off the right step. It's not a phenomenon. It's not a particle exchanging information with another particle and understanding, oh, we need to get closer together. It's all one book of physics. It's a pressure system in every single direction. The reason why liquids curve is because of pressure systems. In the case of perhaps water, you have contours that can create waves that surfers ride. But the bubble is the major clue. They wrote it in the Bible, as it is above, so too is it below. And honestly, it is the most brilliant statement in all of cognitive sciences. It's probably the single statement that is accurate that just cuts across every discipline of thinking. Think about the human psyche, the way an 8-year-old can throw a tantrum and the way a 58-year-old can throw a tantrum. They're actually identical. They're just at different amplitudes and frequencies. I have that episode that YouTube tried to ban called Playground Wisdom. I've never had them turn off monetization faster on a video. And all it says is the lessons you learn on the playground are the same lessons you're going to have to use when you get older. The bully is just a different type of bully. As it is above, so too is it below. And you can reverse that statement and it still works. When the whole Mandelbrot fractal thing came out in the late 80s, where you could just literally see the chaos of infinity, a lot of folks who weren't into mathematics got into mathematics because they were like, how is this tiny little algorithm, because it's a teeny tiny, the Mandelbrot algorithm is infinitesimally tiny. But it takes the results of the algorithm and feeds it back into the next iteration of the same algorithm. It's like taking the everlasting gobstopper at the end of the machine and putting it back in as an ingredient to make the next one, and the next one's different than the one you put in, and it's just infinite. Imagine that you were living your life and you didn't realize that God was creating a murder mystery, basically. Your life was a mystery with clues everywhere. And you pass away out of this mortal coil. Your soul goes back to where you came from. Nothing really matters, okay? Because when you live forever, what could possibly matter, right? But they sit down and they go, hey, did you figure out it was a game? Like Ed Harris in Westworld, did you figure out it was a game? And some of you are going to go, yeah, totally. But, how old were you when you figured it out? Well, luckily this time around, I was in my mid-30s. Well, geez, man, I was in my 60s when I figured it out. Then I didn't have as much time to play the game. And what's the game? There's clues everywhere on how to absolutely control this universe. But like the story in, what is it, Westworld 2 or 3, where they tell the story, I've said this several times, when an elephant is tiny, they tie a rope around its neck and put a stake in the ground. And when the little elephant tries to get away, he realizes, oh man, I am leashed to that spike in the ground. But he tries and tries and tries hundreds of times and hurts his neck and his body, and finally just gives up and says, oh my God, if the rope is around my neck, I cannot go anywhere as long as the spike's in the ground. So they become as big as houses, right? Where they could easily pull that spike out of the ground, but they don't even try, right? Sadly, I think every single one of us has a weak spot where we have that spike in the ground, but it's not really there. You may even believe that you're not smart enough to figure something out. Well, a lot of people just find comfort in that, right? Well, I just want to be lazy inside my brain. And you know what? You could pick one life and just be absolutely worthless to society. I get it. Or you're too old. You don't have the energy anymore. I get it. I think that for every single stage of your existence, potentially, there's clues that you can find at 65 you can't find at 55. And that factors all the way down. And I think that there's clues that you can find at 5 years old that you can't find at 15. Every phase of your life is useful. Every phase of your life is a very special configuration. I think you could be a quadriplegic that can't speak real well, and you're using your eyeballs to look at, a keyboard, and there's something that you can figure out. I think it was it Donald Sutherland was in a movie called Patrick or something like that, where that's what he was, and he kind of had psychic powers at the end of the day. I don't know if we're going to get any supernatural stuff or if that's necessary. If you do, we'll take you to where George Soros is. It's so funny, we all wonder if telekinesis and all this other stuff that they throw on the internet, magic basically, exists, and if the government's found it and all this other stuff. And we know they hate certain people in the world, and they seem to evade any harm. And so the reverse logic with that is, obviously, there is no real cure for hair loss except for plugs, because look at the royal family of England, and there's no way to just super zap somebody out of the sky as much as they want everyone to believe that, because certain people wouldn't be here today. What's really nice when you meditate as a human being is to be able to release your mind of thinking of anything and just have the universe flow through you. When you are standing before the sun and staring at it, it is an ether foundry. The reason why it feels so damn good, and the reason why you need vitamin D, which is basically staring at the sun, is because it is the supercharged power supply. It's like plugging your phone into the wall. You need it. Now, why are you still alive when you go inside the house? And why are you still alive during winter when the sun doesn't come up for as long? Well, because ether's going through your house. It's going through everything. You know, everything's made out of this stuff. It's potentially possible that as you sit on a sofa, the ether that was coming from the sky, from the overall pool of this stuff, some of it becomes the roof of your house. Some of it goes into you. And as soon as it gets out of you, it comes out of you and becomes the sofa you're sitting on. And then it becomes the carpet. Then it becomes the ground. Then it gets stuck in the crust. Some of it bouncing back out. If you meditate and you really understand this, you will have hopefully one of the most peaceful, amazing, one with everything moments that you've ever had in your life. Ether has no attributes other than it exists. It is not positive. It is not negative. Its shape, probably sphere. Just from being hit from all sides, just like sand grains or round little things. Not all the same size, but because they've been pulverized forever. Anyway, hope you dug the clarification. This might be the last time I visit the gravity theory, but I cringe when I go back and listen to some of my attempts of explaining this because I just hadn't had a chance to think it through from an educational standpoint. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. We are no longer on the Facebook group. We're now on Telegram. And again, if Telegram was one of them, then it wouldn't be censored by Apple and it wouldn't be censored by Android. On Android, do not download it from the Google Play Store. Go to telegram.org and download it from there. Because then you won't have your comments censored, either by trying to read comments or make comments. The Ministry of Truth is alive and well at Apple and Google because they are not into you, man. Cool thing about Telegram, you do have to give me your phone number, but what other service do you use where you don't have to put your phone number in? I mean, seriously, which one? Because I have to put mine in everywhere I go. And the other ones go back to alphabet groups and fake dudes like Zuckerberg. So if I'm giving it to him, I'll definitely give it to Telegram. But you can download everything. You can download the photos, download the movies, have them on your phone, send them off to somebody. I am pre-filtering the living you-know-what out of the other channels. Trying to stay away from some of the more macabre stuff. If I post anything that's kind of wild, like a shooting or something, I think it's very, very important. But that's very rare. I want you to have a constant feed of material that you can send to people that have low impact on their psyche, but a high impact on their subconscious. You got to fight fire with fire. Anyway, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.